Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and we have with us Vice Admiral Mike Shoemaker, who is the commander of US Naval Air Forces. Sir, thanks very much for taking time with us. One of the questions that you got, and I want you to elaborate a little bit on, is, everybody always talks about the vulnerability of the carrier, the introduction of new systems, DF-21, DF-26, other undersea systems as well that could be potentially problematic. How is the Navy thinking in order to be able to protect the carrier, right? But nobody ever won with a great defense, right? You have to win also with an offense. Right. Talk to us a little bit about the thinking the Navy has on how it protects its carriers while still being able to prosecute and be able to range and choose the time and place of where you're striking and how you're striking.
So, I talked in there about the integrated capabilities of the air wing and what it can do in terms of operating, protecting the carrier. Now, it's just not the air wing. Clearly, you've got strike group assets that sail with you. Cruisers, destroyers. There'll be submarines out there that will be part of the plan. Maybe not, whether they're tied to the carrier or not. They'll be out there supporting as well. So as we move into those environments, I said, number one, we give a lot of credence to just drawing rings on maps and saying that's a drive in there and you sink a carrier. Well, I totally disagree. There's so much more to understanding that full kill chain of the enemies and then what we would bring to that fight. I think in terms of the integrated capabilities of the air wing and the strike group, we can address, and the things we're doing across domains, submarines sensing and sharing with us, because submarines clearly a challenge. Surface ships, Tommy Roden's team working in distributed lethality, surface action groups that are out now upgunned or empowered, or not empowered, but loaded out with weapon systems that need to be, draw a bigger ring around them, need to be respected by the other side. I think that will help that distributed lethality, the way he operates, a little counter to how we would as an air wing integrated, but that will help us as well as move into that contested airspace, contested environment. But it's got to be a cross-domain solution. We won't do it all from the air wing, but integrate everything from national technical means all the way down to what's going on under the surface to put the picture together so that we know what's around the carrier and how best to defend against it.
And as the commander of Naval Air Forces, obviously you are one of the world's largest air forces just within the confines of the Navy. But you're also working with your Air Force counterparts. Air-sea battle, there was a lot talked about that. If you look at Chinese writings, the thing they got most stressed about was actually air-sea battle, dramatically. How do you envision, as you work with your Air Force counterparts, how you guys coordinate to maximize the application of air power in any theater?
Well, we've shifted from air-sea battle. I think that's now
it is not in vogue anymore.
Joint access from maneuver in the global commons.
Right.
I think JMGC is what we talk about now, and there's counterpart things we do. Navy Air Force talks that happen all the time. Myself, I'm not engaged with my Air Force counterparts, but where we do that kind of tactics development and stuff is from our Naval Aviation Warfighting Development Centers. Old NSOC, now Nautic in Fallon, very much plugged in with what's going on down at Nellis with our Air Force folks. We participate in operations with them both down there, up in at Northern Edge up in Alaska. We learn a lot. We take we take Rhinos, Super Hornets, E-2D. We'll get F-35 in there. Growler is, as I mentioned in the talk, Growler is a key contributor to that mission. Even though they've been flying 5th gen, F-22 and F-35, the Growler tremendously complements what they're trying to do. And so I think in terms of how we do the joint piece, that's where that coordination is happening now. And then we'll exercise it, Northern Edge down in Fallon. We'll bring those guys to Northern Edge and down in Nellis, Mm-hmm. They'll come to Fallon in small numbers to help integrate their unique capabilities as well. So I think it's happening at the Warfighting Development Center level, and then those lessons learned all being provided to our fleet commanders on how best to integrate across the services.
Let me ask you also now about the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps is putting the Bravo, obviously, on the amphibious assault ships. That's kind of a quantum leap in capability from where the Harrier was. And historically, the ARG-MU has sort of gone off and done things on its own, and then the carrier strike groups have done it on their own in terms of doing missions. How do you look at a more integrated future where these platforms are going to be coexisting and operating perhaps as part of a much larger campaign plan?
So Admiral Swift has got some thoughts about this already, and he talks about, as Tom Moore has said, we've got an 11 carrier Navy and a 15, where the requirement really is 15. Admiral Swift has said the same thing. That's about the number, but he sees the ability to put that 5th generation asset on our ARG MEUs and our ARGs not operate disaggregated like we have done in the past. We show up in the Middle East, we send all 3 ships to different locations.
Right.
I think now if you keep them together, you partner them with some of Tommy Roden's surface ships, and you build a kind of a strike group light with the capabilities, the 5th gen capabilities that brings. And I think it gives you lots of options on how you maneuver multiple groups now, to include Tommy's surface action groups as well. And so and as we work up and train to that environment, we're pretty good from a carrier strike group perspective based on things we've learned from our strike group commanders that operate forward deployed in Japan in that environment all the time. And so we've got to make sure that as we work up those ARGs and integrate the surface ships with them, kind of to make them mini strike groups, they're practicing those same kind of high-end tactics that our strike groups do that our carrier strike groups do right now.
Last 2 quick questions. You're one of the nation's most experienced aviators. You deployed aboard 8 carriers, including the legendary Enterprise and Big John and a number of other ships in the equally legendary A7E Corsair, but as well in the F-18. As you look at the USS Gerald R. Ford, obviously an enormous amount of criticism for the delays of it, but it is the first in class of a completely revolutionary ship. How do you see, first, how important is that, getting that ship online to be the 11th carrier? And what are the capabilities you think that ship is going to be bringing to the fleet?
So if you look at where we are right now, we're operating with 10 carriers. The force is stressed. The demand out there for carrier strike groups exceeds what we can supply. We've got to get forward to the fleet as soon as we can. Because as I mentioned in the talking, we've always got one in a deep overhaul, kind of a midlife refueling complex overhaul. We typically have one in a docking availability, so that limits the numbers we can use. So to get back to having 11, and that's a minimum, is important. And so getting forward to the fleet as quick as we can, to include maybe even avoiding full ship shock trials. We've never done that with a first-in-class ship. CNO has talked about that in terms of what can we do, maybe to do it for follow-on ships, but get forward back to the fleet as soon as possible. When she does comes with incredible new capabilities. You mentioned transformational in many cases, but we put a lot of stuff on a first-of-class ship rather than doing it more iteratively as we've done in the past. And so we'll get her to sea this fall. We'll start to operate her. We'll start to do the work with the air wing coming aboard in our shakedown probably in the early part of 17. And so as I look at, just there visiting a couple months ago, as I said in the brief, and I look at the way the deck is laid out, the way the combat systems on board are laid out, the survivability we've built into that, the growth capacity that's built into it, the quality of life for sailors on board forward, and then the capacity of the 2 new power plants to generate energy for follow-on type of self-defense weapons, maybe directed energy, things like that, I think they'll be game-changing. And we just need to get forward again, like MQ-25, get her to the fleet, start operating her like we do the other carriers, but then we'll quickly realize the ways we may want to adjust how we employ Ford-class carriers based on her unique capabilities.
But it is important to standardize that design, isn't it? Because there's a concern that the newer versions of Ford will be dumbed down somehow and not have that capability.
Well, I mean, there's some things we're looking at. One is a kind of a more enterprise-wide air defense radar instead of the dual-band radar that's on Ford right now. I don't think that will dumb us down. I think it may be, that's one we'll eventually retrofit to other platforms as well. So it may make sense as we follow on with Kennedy and Enterprise 79 and 80. But I think probably the most important thing is we start building at regular intervals. We just kind of have interrupted the production of Ford and the follow-on classes so that we can start taking advantage of buying 2 ships together at once instead of just there's a lot of non-recurring engineering that went into Ford that kind of adds to that overall cost. But I think the value in the long run, and I'm not the guy that's an expert at doing how you account for inflation, but Nimitz was $4.5 billion in 1975. So
we've had a little bit of inflation since 1975.
A little bit of inflation, so there's an article out today about Ford F-150, what it cost in 1985, and then what it costs today. So the technology is much better from where we were 30 or 40 years ago. And so it costs a little more to put that and incorporate that into our platforms. We need to understand that, I think, as we move forward.
I want to ask one last question about the readiness piece of it. Obviously, that's a challenge for everybody in the services. Sequestration had its impact. Obviously, high operational loads for the last 15 years have contributed to that. Fewer carriers, more missions have contributed to that. From a readiness standpoint, how are you working out of that readiness bathtub right now? Which is, part of it is spare parts, part of it is training, there are a whole bunch of things that go into it.
So General Davis and I are both very much focused on readiness and recovery across the force, both of our forces. And in fact, our brief in CNO coming out tomorrow, the third iteration of a brief. We learned a lot of lessons from strike fighters, the kind of the lines of effort that we need to manage to recover across the force. And you mentioned a few of them. The supply piece, parts is key. Both parts to our depots as we do the deep repairs on airplanes and parts to our flight lines. Then there is the depot production. There's even beyond just the deep maintenance that's done on legacy Hornets to extend their service life. There's regular inductions to the depots that are done across all the type model series. We have to make sure are happening on time. And then in-service repairs across all of our platforms on our flight lines that can't be done at the O level. That takes artisans and engineers to do that. I think we're learning across all those lines of effort how to apply them to each type model series. But in the end, we tend to gauge our readiness on the number of hours we fly. And that flight hour count is important, but there's a lot of other readiness enabler accounts that pay for depot maintenance, pay for parts, pay for the emergent maintenance and analysis that can happen right on our flight lines today that would quickly allow us to keep generating readiness. So there's a whole underlying readiness piece to the resourcing that I think we're getting the message across. Those enablers are critical that we resource them at least closer to requirement. We took the 3 years of sequestration, we dug a significant readiness divot in many of those accounts. We still need, and we've not, to fill that in, you've got to obviously fund beyond the requirement. We've not done that, so we're getting close to requirement in those accounts, but across the force, we're still accepting risk. Navy is, even in our tiered readiness model, the fleet response plan, accepting risk in maintenance phase so we can ensure the guys in the middle of workups and on deployment have the airplanes they need and the resources they need, and then maybe accept a little risk on the backside of deployments when they get into a sustainment period. So I think we're recovering. The needles are slowly moving across all those lines of effort, not as fast as General Davis or I would like, but we're getting there.
And in very, very briefly, having come off the boat, we went aboard on and off with the Rawhides. Rawhide Airways did a great job getting us on and off on VRC-40. Obviously, that's the C-2 legendary airplane going out of service, being replaced in what is seen as a transformational move to get the V-22 out there to do the COD mission. Very briefly, you were talking about exercises in your talk. There's still lingering skepticism whether or not the C-2, the V-22 will be able to easily replace the C-2. What are you finding in some of these fleet exercises?
Yeah. So we just finished a 2-week, we call it a fleet battle experiment out on Carl Vinson. Had a 4-plane Osprey detachment. They brought an extra airplane out. We envisioned probably 3 as what the det size will be. But as they operated with Carl Vinson, and we didn't have COD support, we did all of it with Ospreys for 2 weeks. I mean, there was a couple COD runs, only because there were some things that had to happen. But they simulated being on deployment, operating like we would expect them to operate in a deployment kind of mindset. And as they integrated with the cyclic ops on the carrier, we found lots of benefits, lots of flexibility, lots of ways to maybe better utilize a rotary asset landing versus having to bring in a fixed wing tailhook aircraft. There's lots of things we can learn moving forward. The ops officer and the air boss on the ship very pleased with the flexibility the Osprey provides to include coming aboard at night, which we don't do with CODs. Right. Then you look at the range will be as good or better than COD was, a little bit smaller cargo, and we're talking in terms of single-digit percentages, a couple fewer people to bring it on and off. But I think the flexibility, the integration with cyclic operations, the ability to land at night, brings some tremendous capability. And we'll learn as we do it more often. But that fleet battle experiment was designed to help us as we develop our future concept of operations for that detachment as we move forward. So I think it's very successful.
And different tailhooker certificates, as we talked about, will have to be distributed in the future.
Oh, absolutely.
Vice Admiral Mike Shoemaker, sir, Commander of Naval Air Forces, thanks so much for spending so much time with us.
Yeah, thanks, Bobby. Yeah, thank you very much.